Hello, YouTube family. I am here to talk to you about Vogue pattern 8804, designed by Claire Schaeffer. This is the French jacket. It is probably one of the most coveted things that people want to sew. And this was my first jacket that I made. This is it here. I made it probably about 9 months ago. It took me several months to do it, and I don't usually do pattern reviews, but because of the popularity of this particular style and being that such a classic piece from the Chanel type look, I thought I would do that on my channel and just see kind of what people think about it. Generally, I don't sew a lot of commercial patterns, and there's reasons for that. When I came back to sewing about 6 years ago, when I started my business, I had attempted to sew a number of different commercial patterns, and I found that everything had changed since I went to design school, 25 years before, which is a long time, granted. But not just the styles, but more like the quality of the patterns, the quality of the design, the quality of the illustrations, and the ease of sewing just wasn't there in commercial patterns for me. And so that's why I went away from it and decided, well, I can do my own. I'll just design my own pattern. So that's what I do. I design patterns. But there are some that are really excellent. And I guess I'd like to share with you the ones that I found that are really excellent, that are really worth your time to learn and to pursue and have in your pattern collection. There are those of us who have, umpteen gazillion patterns in our collection. You know who you are. And it's good to know the good ones from the bad ones, because some of them, quite honestly, they're not worth your time. They're just not. I have seen so many errors in illustrations and in techniques, things that they leave out that would make it so much easier to sew and so much more worth your time and effort and make you appreciate the finished product. I think a lot of times people want to sew, they want to learn to sew, and then they start getting these commercial patterns that just don't have the quality that they should have, and they get frustrated and they don't want to continue sewing, and I completely understand that. So anyway, back to the point. Vogue 8804. So I kind of have mixed feelings about this for a couple of reasons. I absolutely adore the pattern overall. Absolutely thumbs up. It is a great pattern. It fits really well. I didn't have to make a ton of pattern adjustments, which is unusual for me. It is one of the few styles that Vogue has labeled as being good for the rectangular type figure. And I think that's kind of a problem with the Vogue patterns. The other companies don't even address what type figure you have, mind you. But the Vogue patterns always have this great little guide on the back. Maybe you didn't even know it was there. But they show you, what type of clothes are going to look good on your particular figure type. And it's really helpful because I have tried to sew things that were supposed to be good, for example, the hourglass figure, and they just don't look good on my rectangular figure, and overall it was a waste of my time. So I would rather know in advance what's going to look good on me and what's not. And more I'm seeing that the rectangular figure is just sort of left out of the loop. I don't know if nobody knows how to design for a rectangular figure, or there's just not many things that look good on us rectangular figured people. But anyway, this is one of the few that really is flattering on a rectangular figure. So a few things to note. The pattern is almost entirely hand sewn. Like I said, it took me about 3 months to sew the entire thing. And part of the process is taking the time to really read through, all the directions, but preparing to sew. It's not just the sewing, it's the preparing to sew. And that is marking all the seam lines with different colors of thread, marking the quilting markings, because the inside of the jacket is quilted to the outside. So you have to mark all of those. And then you have to go back and mark the darts. And they use different colors thread for all these things in couture sewing, and she talks about that in here because she is known for her studies of couture garments. She went into all these fashion houses, looked at their couture lines, and applied that knowledge to her sewing patterns. So they're just absolutely amazing. Anyway, all of that takes time, and it can be very overwhelming at first. If you have never done any kind of tailoring, never done any kind of hand or any kind of really detailed sewing, that can be super intimidating. And when I started, I kind of thought, oh my gosh, this is going to take forever, which it did, but stick with me. It did take forever, but it was worth it in the end. And there's a few things that really make it worthwhile. So after you have marked all the seam lines, then she recommends putting it together, of course, basting it together and checking the fit. So in this pattern, you can kind of see from the drawing, actually you can't really tell, but most of it is the quilting lines that you see here. There aren't a lot of seam lines. The front is all one piece, so there's a seam at the side, and then the back has a seam at center back. So that makes it fairly easy to do fitting adjustments because it's simple. You don't have complicated, other seam lines and stuff that you're going to run into problems with. So that's one thing I love about this. It also means that basting it together and fitting it before you get started is really important, because generally you're working with some more expensive type fabrics. So fabrics for this garment are recommended tweed, boucle, and mohair. Okay, all of those are high-end fabrics, mostly wool. Tweed would definitely be a wool fabric. Boucle would be what I am wearing. It is a blend. You can get wool boucles, but they're not 100% wool most of the time. They have other fibers in them. And the reason for that is to get this flocked look, they use other fibers in the process to do that. The problem that I found when I was doing my hand stitching and so forth was that these little flecks of black in this fabric, this particular fabric, which by the way came from Britex Fabrics in San Francisco, is very difficult to pierce with a needle. I could pierce the blue parts of the fabric very easily, but the black was very difficult because it was a different kind of fiber content. So I would actually recommend for your first jacket that you try and go with a fiber that has more wool in it, or even mohair. So mohair is a type of wool. That's the other recommended fabric for this. And those are expensive fabrics. You're going to spend anywhere from $30 a yard to, a couple $100 a yard if you wanted to. They're expensive. And you don't want to make mistakes with that type of fabric. So rule number one is to get a similar weight fabric and make your muslin. Make a test garment to make sure that your fit is going to work for you. So I had done that. I had done mine in denim. I should have brought that out for you to look at, but I didn't think of that. Anyway, it's fairly easy to fit. So once you've got the fitting down, then you can start with the construction. And the construction in this is what gave me some trials and tribulations, actually putting it together. So you may not know, but there is a system to sewing garments. Generally, we start with the top and work our way down. So we do the shoulders, we do the side seams, we do the sleeves, pockets and things are done very first thing before we put it together most of the time. And then we put it all together. So here, this is, and the lining on a garment like this would normally be done the very last. So it's all different here. So you have an interlining, you have a interfacing that goes in here, and they're calling for stitching the lining to the pieces before the garment's even constructed. So that's very different from regular sewing. And there's reasons for that. The way that they put it together, it makes sense, but in some ways when I was working on it, it seemed like, why am I doing this? This is the longest, stupidest way to put anything together I've ever seen. But in the end, it really works. And it is just completely different. So pieces are like quilted and basted, actually basted first. then quilted, and then assembled. So that makes this a very different process. Things like hems are normally finished towards the end, like after the lining is installed, and then you stitch the lining over the hem. Not the case here. This is really unique. So you're putting the lining together with the outer part of the jacket, you're quilting it, and then you're doing the hems and so forth around the neck of the jacket, the front of the jacket. They are just turning over a 5/8" hem, hand stitching it, and then finishing it with the edge of the lining. Very different, and I found very difficult. So here's another tip. This garment calls for so much hand stitching, and there's interfacing absolutely everywhere. So the neckline, the front, the sleeve cuffs, the sleeve placket's got all interfacing in it. You have two choices. You can either use a fusible interfacing or a sew-in interfacing. I have had not very good luck using fusible interfacings. I don't know what they're doing to fusible interfacing these days, you guys, but they are just shooting themselves in the foot. It is just not a good product. It bubbles, it puckers, you wash it, it shrinks more than the outside of the garment. It just isn't the quality that it used to be. So she makes a recommendation here in the pattern to use, I think it was in the pattern, otherwise I read it in one of her books. But anyway, Claire Schaeffer's recommendation is to use a fusible knit interfacing, which is interesting because the fabric is a woven, it's not a knit fabric. You could possibly make it in a knit fabric, but it's supposed to be a woven fabric. And I like that interfacing. I have tried it on other projects and I really like it. For this project, I decided I would use what most people would probably choose, and that was the sew-in interfacing. It's not fusible, but it's sew-in. And again, I ran into some issues with it. One of the issues being you can't pierce it with a needle. With a hand sewing needle, it's very difficult to pierce. So that made doing all the trim work on the jacket really difficult because you can't sew through it. That, along with the fact that you have these, little flecks of stuff in the fabric that you can't sew through either. It was really frustrating at times. So I had to work on it in short increments and walk away and come back to it because I would just get really frustrated. So definitely choose a fabric that you can easily pierce with a needle, and choose an interfacing that you can easily pierce with a needle. You could use hair canvas. That would be another option. Going forward, I think I'm going to make my next jacket with hair canvas because I bought a whole bunch of it and I just want to try it and see how it works. But I'm sure that would be a great option. So other things about this jacket, the front pieces are constructed separately from the back, and then you put them together. And they are first put together at the side seam, which is very interesting, very different. So they are constructing these things in a flat manner, then putting the side seam together and overlapping the linings and stitching them by hand. There is a couple of spots where she recommends taking in a small dart for fitting on the inside of the jacket, which helps to give it its beautiful shape. I love that. It works great. Even if you don't have a dart on the outside, you can still have it on the inside, and that helps shape the jacket a little bit to your figure. So absolutely recommend doing that. And then when we get to the trims, so the pockets are all hand stitched, just pockets are hand stitched on. They have trim at the top, as the rest of the jacket does. All the trim work is shaped with steam. So they give you a template for the ribbon at the neck and the braid, and you have to pin it down on your ironing board and then steam it, she says, several times to get it to hold shape. You let it sit, let it sit overnight before you apply it to the jacket and hand stitch it to the jacket. It sounds kind of crazy if you've never done that before. I have never done that before. I thought, I don't know, this might be a total waste of time, but it works great. It works great. And the ribbon is polyester. So you wouldn't think that it would shape and mold that much, but it really does. It makes a big difference. So don't skip steps. That's my next bit of advice on this jacket. It's a lengthy process. It's going to take a lot of time to do it right. And it's one of the things that it's worth taking the time to do and taking the time to learn to do it right. And if you do, you have great results. You really will. I promise. So there is that. Then after the braid is done and so forth, then we get around to putting the sleeves in, and at the very end we get to the buttonholes, the facing and the buttonholes. So the interesting thing about this jacket is it has hand-stitched buttonholes on the front. Don't look too closely because I didn't do a very good job of it. And then on the back, it's a bound buttonhole on the lining side. Never done this before in my life. Oh my gosh, I learned a lot. I had to really have a lot of patience to get it done, let me tell you, because it's super frustrating. So sewing through this fabric, which was kind of like iron, trying to sew through cardboard or something, it just was so difficult. Then I ran into the problem of, with the width of my trim, the buttonhole is barely in the right position. Had I known I was going to be doing it in this order, I would have maybe stitched the buttonholes first and then put the trim on, but there isn't room to really have a lot of error here. So be very careful when you're marking your buttonholes. Be very careful when you're stitching your buttonholes, that they are exactly the right size, because it's very easy to get lost in this sea of, fabric here and not really get exactly the right placement. Stitching them by hand was not as time consuming as I thought, but it's not easy. And I really had to practice several times to get the buttonhole to look halfway decent. I have a lot of respect for anybody that can hand stitch a buttonhole, let me tell you, because it's not a real easy thing. I tried the silk thread, so the recommendation is that you use silk thread to do the buttonholes. I didn't like it. It's too thin. It's so slippery. It's very small stitches anyway, and it just sort of it blends in with the fabric, but I couldn't even tell what part of the fabric I'd stitched and what part I didn't stitch. So I ended up going over my buttonholes twice. First time I did it, it just didn't look like anything. So I stitched them a second time, and some of them, I think I even did a third time. I ended up adding some cording to the buttonhole. So there's two ways to do a hand-bound buttonhole. You can just stitch it as it is on around like the cut of the fabric where the buttonhole is going to be. Or you can add a thicker thread that you would kind of hold in place with your finger and then stitch over that to make like a raised buttonhole. And I ended up doing that a little on mine because at least I could see it. It helps to define where the buttonholes are, and I felt like it was going to hold up better. It just didn't on this particular fabric. It was, fraying real easily, and a lot of boucle fabrics do fray very easily. It just seemed like even stitching around it twice, it wasn't going to really hold up very long. So I had some issues with that. And then the buttonholes, you're supposed to have a button at the very top, a buttonhole up here on my jacket, but with the way the trim worked out and the placement, I didn't even have room to put it up there, so I didn't even bother sewing that one. So I don't have a buttonhole up here. I put a button up here just to make it look good, but there's no buttonhole if you looked really close. And then on the inside, so let's talk about that. Stitching these little bitty welts onto the lining, which is slicker than slick. It's recommended that you use silk thread, which is slicker than slick, and it is quite a feat to get them to look like anything. They do look rather small, but they actually fit my buttons, and I don't know if I love it. I would perhaps in the future just do a regular buttonhole on the sewing machine. I feel like it would be more durable. It's on the inside of the jacket. No one really sees it anyway, but food for thought. You might try a sample buttonhole with the bound technique and then try one on the machine and just see what you like better. You may choose one over the other. The buttonholes themselves took me, I don't know, probably 2 weeks. I mean, it took a long time to go over them more than once and make sure the placement was right, and a lot of fiddling around, marking them, remarking, blah blah blah. It just was really kind of a frustrating thing, like I said. So if you're short on time, that might be one way that you could speed this whole thing up a little bit, is to just put regular buttonholes in them. The other thing is the sleeves call for buttonholes in the sleeves. I didn't put those in. I was so frustrated at that point. I'm like, I'm not going to bother with that. I just stitched the buttons through the placket on the jackets. They're not functional, but that's okay because I don't think I would ever unbutton them anyway. Okay, so if you have any questions regarding this jacket, I would love to be able to help you. So if you can leave a comment and let me know your thoughts, if this is a pattern that you had tried, if you liked it, if you thought it fit well, if you thought the construction was great or not so great, I'd be interested to know. I'm thinking about doing more reviews of patterns here. Probably will be just Vogue patterns, nothing else, just Vogue patterns on my channel. And if it's something that you are interested in, please let me know. You can find out more about my business on chambraybluessewing.com. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos that are coming out, and make sure you turn on the bell for notification bell so that you get notified when I post a new video. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.